We've all heard the phrase, "That's not scientific," or "It hasn't been double-blind tested." In fact, it seems that there is a war between what is said to be scientific versus what is intuitive, or even what knowledge comes from, quote, colleges versus the school of hard knocks, religion, your grandmother, other loving influences, or just what you figured out on your own. Like the phrase goes, reinventing the wheel, or creating the next iPhone. And then there's the phrase, he or she is a trained professional because they went to college and so didn't, and so is merely an armchair this or that, armchair philosopher. They're an amateur. They're not, quote, scientifically trained. This can then even boil down to a quote-unquote war of sorts, a struggle between, quote, science versus religion. And thirdly, I might add, spirituality as contrasted with religion also. For instance, Brene Brown, who has a doctorate degree and does much work on shame, has written extensively on intuition. Now, I'll just insert at this point as to who I am talking about this, so that I attended West Point and graduated. My area of concentration was electrical engineering, a most complex matter, and also studied extensively liberal arts. And to fit that all in, we attended classes 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. And then at the age of 41, I began 4 years of study at mathematics at Berea College, a school where 100% of the students were on full scholarship. And I attended half-time as a community member. And thirdly, as to issues of complexity and so on, I amassed over a 15-year period of time 170,000 flashcards made and reviewed extensively with the SuperMemo software repetition program, spending some 10,000 hours or more on it in that 15-year period to review in an optimal manner what I had been studying. Mostly about people, society, religion, and so on. Now, usually I hear science being bandied about the word in terms of, has an idea been tested or not, versus do you just think it is so? I rewatched, for instance, the other day, a fascinating movie, The Man Who Knew Infinity. Jeremy, was it Irons? Jeremy, trying to remember the name, played in that movie. It was the story of the mathematical genius Ramanujan in India. About 100 years ago. He grew up, spent time in a hut, and developed the most profound mathematical theories with no college study. And at one point, eventually finding a man, Hardy, in England, at Trinity College, Cambridge University in England, to pair up with and work with, before his untimely death at about age 32 of tuberculosis. He was brilliant. But there was the contention by Hardy, who was not a religious man, that Ramanujan's thinking wasn't rigorous enough. It was too intuitive. And, for instance, when Hardy asked Ramanujan, how do you know these brilliant theories you came up with? Ramanujan said, in turn, I just know. God told me. Well, this is not a religious discussion, and I am very favorable to considerably what many religions have to say, but at any rate, there was this profound then discussion back and forth. Hardy wanted Ramanujan to tighten things up and develop proofs, theories, as to what Ramanujan arguably found intuitively more than Hardy's view, more rigorous. But what then, how does this tie into what we call science? Is science merely testing things, like statistically or in a test tube to see if it's true? My thought all of a sudden, more and more, is that I like thinking of it more in terms of how to manage complexity. And ironically, to call something or someone scientific when there's little rigor there, little complexity, or too focused on details in terms of what you might call being nitpicky, at the expense of the overall mastery of complexity there in front of us, is what I've heard called pseudoscience. I like that term much. Hence, I think it very interesting to hear that if someone went to college and is a, quote, trained professional, because they're, quote, scientifically oriented, or they studied a whole panoply of the field already expressed before them by others, does that mean they mastered the field in terms of complexity management? Or did they simply attend classes, do great at grades, claiming summa cum laude achievement even, and yet maybe there was little mastery of the complexities involved, kind of like using an iPhone to photograph something off of a menu, or talking that you own a set of encyclopedias, and so those encyclopedias are very smart and thus very complex and scientific. But maybe we should put the word pseudoscience to that. The real mastery isn't there. So we've heard some interesting phrases too, like, oh, that's rocket science, or oh, that isn't rocket science, it's obvious. Or phrases like, it has a lot of moving parts. Now, for most of my life, or the first half, I'd say, I'm now 61, I had a strong aversion, or rather a little war inside of me between wanting mastery of complexity and yet saying to myself, well, am I just being nitpicky here? Am I being what some might say obsessive compulsive? Am I focusing too much on specks of dust and then calling yourself scientific or oriented in the wrong direction thus on details? And I would sometimes find myself shying away from mastery of details and claiming, well, if I pay attention to details, I'm just being obsessive compulsive, so why focus on details? Just go more for the overall picture, the intuitive view. And I'd have a war going on, back and forth, back and forth. But then in the last couple of years, it started dawning on me in snatches here and there that maybe that the mastery of details and focus on complexity at times can be done for two separate and distinctly opposite reasons. And this is where I think we all too often don't see it. That many times trying to master details in what amounts to being labeled as obsessive compulsive, having OCD, or being nitpicky, or even the derogatory term anal or compulsive, tends to be, I see more and more now, a matter of catastrophe managing. That the mastery of details for certain people is in the service of avoiding something very painful that you consider thus a catastrophe. This was illuminated all the more by my watching and rewatching a 7-minute video over the past couple of years by a psychiatrist, I believe it was, Aaron Beck, in the 60s, who, in a video back then, had said in his belief that all psychiatric disorders tend to boil down to catastrophizing something. Now, some would say, on the other hand, there being a book written, The Age of Anxiety, that might have been by Rollo May, a psychoanalyst. But Aaron Beck turned the issue of anxiety or fears, and noting Buddhists often focus a lot on fear management too. Aaron Beck kind of took a new spin and called it the issue of catastrophizing. Now, I think for certain people, they fear death most because they catastrophize or think a lot about what might happen after death as to punishment, especially if it goes on forever. And thus, a lawyer, Chin, his last name, wrote a book on managing the fear of death, and that was a considerable part he brought up. That we sometimes, some of us, have an inordinate fear of what happens after death, if anything. I would call that thus the big kahuna of something to catastrophize. But there being other things we catastrophize too. And at any rate, it dawned on me more and more, especially clearly right now at present, that you can focus on details, complexity management, in the service of trying to manage and minimize what you catastrophize, maybe one or more things, if any. Or, here's the alternative, that catastrophe can be trimmed more and more in one's life, hopefully, and replaced with more and more desire to grow, to build, to have joy, to promote that in others too. And this necessitating a more and more complex view and application of complexity to everyone and everything. Especially in the people area, a highly complex field, whether psychology, sociology, religion, anthropology, and so on. Very, very, very complex. It even gets complex as to dissecting and reworking our vocabulary as it applies to people versus machines, inanimate objects in general. And there's the psychologist in Canada, Jordan Peterson, who has made an impact in certain ways with his application and inclusion of religion, Christianity in this case, into the sphere of psychology. And while there are profound things I don't agree with him on, and how it played out in his life and influencing others, I will say I most admired a video of his that was very short, 2-3 minutes, on his view of what he called mental illness's origin. I don't agree with that term itself, by the way, but at any rate, he feels the number one concern there as to our struggles is the inability to manage complexity. And everybody, I think, realizes on one level or another that things are getting more and more complex every day, in life in general, and even with regard to regulatory requirements for anything and everything. That even goes for the evolution of the automobile as to the features on it and the design of it, as well as the regulatory requirements imposed upon engineers and workers who design and construct automobiles. Now, some of the most profoundly wonderful people I've known have been some of my relatives, including my grandmother who brought me up my first 4 years. She came to Ellis Island, New York, from Poland, a war refugee in 1950, having a 6th grade education and very sparse English, and read very little. Interestingly, thus, this was largely the case for my mother, too. Again, 6th grade education, albeit she managed to get a high school degree in general. But these individuals had the greatest of heart, the greatest of courage for what they went through in Poland during the war years, amongst other things, as well as how their religious faith tied in to strengthen their values and the overall level of empathy they had. For I believe if well loved by at least someone in childhood, that is a fostering of empathy in a person, and they were well loved. You might also say many from the hills, so to speak, the hills of Appalachia, or many indigenous persons in general, have oftentimes great heart, great empathy, great wisdom even. But here is the rub. I believe my grandmother could have been a great person on a national or world level if only she had complexity management abilities. And in the service of growth, I might add, not in the service of avoidance, minimization of what we call catastrophizing. She was not a person to catastrophize. But the management of complexity was not there, as is oftentimes, sadly, for many, many people with the greatest of empathy. You might say thus a great heart, but not in the technical sense scientific. Although, again, I would make a very strong distinction of the difference between being scientific-minded in terms of complexity management versus pseudoscience, where one simply attends classes or gets great grades or never reviews anything, never grows a model of reality that's more and more complex all the time, but not in the so-called nitpicky sense. For one can, for instance, dress impeccably, or have a car that is well organized inside and spotless and without dings. The latest model, expensive. And yet, that can lose track of what's more important. So are we to label that car then the essence of being scientific? Or is it, in the sense, pseudoscience? Because the overall view and level of complexity is missing as to what's most important. For instance, was it about in the 1850s? Henry David Thoreau, a graduate, by the way, of Harvard, who once had a pencil company. I believe he started it or ran it. He went to the Walden Pond area, built a cabin, and his express purpose was to get to know reality better by lessening requirements on life, simplifying his life so what was most important would come to the surface. You might say, if a Christian, be still and know that I am God, or cut back on the inundation we tend to have of a myriad of details assaulting us, so that you see what is staring you right in the face or right in front of your nose, the phrase may go. You might say that's a somewhat intuitive view or just a cutting down of a myriad of data smog. There being a book by that title name, by the way, that I have, Data Smog, so that what is most prescient, most important, pops to the surface. that might otherwise be buried in a mass of details, like owning 1,000 books in your personal library and not knowing which books, which 5 perhaps, are the most important. And thus, maybe in the past especially, some of our greatest leaders and thinkers, including Lincoln, were considered the wisest or most profoundly influential because they read almost nothing. Maybe the Bible, Blackstone's commentary, as per Lincoln, and that was about it. And he had to walk 18 miles each direction to borrow one or more law books as he studied law. And thus, building complexity as to how he understood people and law by managing what you call data smog, so that he focused his attention on what was most important, including observation of people and thinking things through. I'd like to wind this down by citing some people I've ran across as per reading about their lives or watching videos where they were in the video. These people, arguably to the service generally of humanity, were great at complexity management, but many people might not know this. Here are some examples. Some of our greatest leaders have been lawyers, interestingly. And you might say this is a very nuanced way of approaching things, thus, in that the lawyer has to understand words quite well. And people, another group being those with holding a degree in business administration, hence the term MBA. Mr. Trump being one of them, having attended one of the finest schools in that sort, Wharton. I'm also apprised of several other people I admire in certain respects, like Ayman Aghi, who does a lot of work with content creation, course creation. A very empathetic man, comparatively speaking. He has an MBA also. Then there being a woman who wrote a book on divorce, Twiggy Bean, who has a PhD, but she also has a Master's of Business Administration, or maybe it's at the level of the PhD. I'm not sure. Now, in another vein, if we're going to talk about religious leaders, I greatly admire people in a panoply of faiths, including especially the Buddhists, sometimes. Ajahn Brahm being one of these I most admire. He heads up a monastery near Perth, Australia, and is a very popular man when he goes lecturing, especially, including it being cited that in Los Angeles' airport, he is mobbed sometimes by people to the extent he's thinking about wearing a wig and he has to escape to the bathroom after book signings that are an hour long, and people follow him even into the bathroom. Now, interestingly, this man is a various combination of factors, I believe, as to his wisdom and presence, impact, and popularity, amongst many, that is, not everyone. He has a degree from Cambridge University in theoretical physics, but taught 1 year before spending 10 years in the jungles of, Thailand, in the forests, studying with his master before hitting the scene in Australia. Thus, complexity management skills, once again. Another Buddhist of impact, I was told anyway, Pema, who once had a family and then migrated away from this. She studied at Berkeley University, perhaps the flagship school of public universities in California, where you have to be able to think quite complexly just to get in, relatively speaking. And as per what they call activists, or I forget another word more appropriate maybe, Andrei Sakharov from Russia. He was a physicist also. Also, a month or two ago, I watched a video by a Dr. Gottlieb, and she gave profound analysis to what's wrong in relationships. She said the number one thing we all want, and is most important, is to be understood, and that the skill or ability to understand people is a very profound one. Now, what she didn't say right out at any rate is that people are very complex. You might say, thus, to understand people, you need to be a rocket science or theoretical physics or a theoretical physicist or great mathematician as applied to people, to manage the complexities about them, rather than just an intuitive spin on the subject. Yet another man was Andrew Carnegie and his spin-off Napoleon Hill, who studied extensively from Carnegie and under the direction of him and financial backing, and then wrote the book Think and Grow Rich. That was, again, by Napoleon Hill, but influenced strongly by Andrew Carnegie, whose family came from Scotland after Andrew Carnegie's father found his small weaving business or textile business at home go belly up as the industrialized revolution came on, and the whole family packed up and came to America to restart things. And if I remember correctly, Andrew Carnegie in turn had but, quote, a mere fifth grade education. But what's very interesting is that in time, Andrew Carnegie found himself in companies, or one company, where he managed to learn the complexities of the operation of it and mastered this. I don't know, at some administrative levels. And thus, even though seemingly a man just of fifth grade level, was a very complex man, and amongst other things, took the price of steel and brought it down, way down. Now, I'm not going to say the man was a genius in the people department. I think many despised him, and he also contributed greatly to the war effort at that point in time, upon which some say he felt very guilty and depressed over, and gave away his fortune to try and assuage his conscience. But there's no question in my mind that the man was able to handle complexity exceedingly well. I'll give one last example from a video I watched of this man, Boris Yeltsin, who had ups and downs in his political career in Russia, contributed greatly to the restructuring of the country. His earlier career was marked by much strife and non-success, but then he took some time off, so to speak, and began to understand people much better and from different angles, and then came back on the scene like gangbusters, especially as per a certain speech that had a marked influence on the public, as in that video on him. Now, interestingly, one little bit stuck out there as to what made this man tick. And I love that phrase, trying to understand what makes someone tick. In other words, understanding the complexities of them. It was said he was an engineer, and he did great work with regard in the area of building apartment complexes for people as an engineer, tied to the government operations of such, management of such. And he was very successful at this. Thus, again, an engineer approach to people as a political leader, ironically. You have to scratch your head then, wondering, maybe this is part of the training of a politician, regardless of how we might have the anecdotes against them, that many politicians have training as being a lawyer. And while this is not mathematics or theoretical physics, it is arguably complexity training as per words. And it deals with people, not something more of an office setting like finance. So here are some parting thoughts of mine then on, again, the topic of the push more and more for people to go to college, to be, quote, trained professionals, and to seemingly apply the scientific method. But what is thus the scientific method as per testing a hypothesis to try and arrive at truths, but for actually, in my mind, the upshot mostly being building complexity management, as opposed to a more intuitive grasp of things that doesn't get down to the intricacies, perhaps. Sadly, all too often, when we look at something and say that a person has been scientifically trained or trained in general, or is even called a college graduate, this does not in any way, shape, or form cover the following aspects. These are never typically examined. Issues such as, why did they want to study science and try and master, to some degree or another, complexity? Maybe we need to ask, was it in the service of trying to lessen their fears of catastrophe, of something happening? And hence, all too often, detail-oriented people being called perfectionists, or having this, quote, malady, as some would say, of obsessive compulsiveness, or being anal even, from the parlance in movies of those in New York, say. Of course, that being a broad generalization, but still. As opposed, I would say, to what you might find alternatively quite differently in the people of the hills, the sticks of Appalachia, or the indigenous persons, even those in the forests or in Alaska. Again, broadly speaking. Thus, the application, here's the upshot in my mind, the application of pursuing complexity understanding, of getting to be a rocket scientist, so to speak, in people areas especially. This can take two directions, I believe, and I've seen this in my own life. Is it in the minimizing of things we feel would be a catastrophe because to us they represent such? Often this approach coming from childhood as per feeling insecure. Abused, sometimes you might call it, I don't like that word, in combination with not having felt loved by anybody. But the alternative being to apply complexity to build more and more happiness, more growth, as opposed to fear management. Thus, to use complexity to build more joy, happiness, empathy, serenity, as opposed to avoidance of fears, especially as labeled a catastrophe in our minds. One last final comment. We've heard the phrase that everything could go to hell in a handbasket if one detail were missed. Why would that phrase even exist, if not for fear that if one detail is missed, the phrase also popping up in my mind, everything might unravel. Unraveling and going to hell in a handbasket, in my mind, the same concept of that if some detail is missed because we didn't take a complex enough view or control view, that everything would fall apart and become a catastrophe. as opposed to something that you might call uncomfortable, but tolerable to some extent. Hence, we have in our history of mankind various despots, we might call them, or war criminals, people very non-admirable, who were arguably quite brilliant. They had quite strong complexity management skills in certain areas, including Mr. Hitler, who had quite an apparatus that some consider quite efficient, but not only not empathetic to the max, but in the service, I now believe, likely to manage his fears that we call catastrophes in his mind. The same goes for Stalin, who, by the way, attended seminary, I don't know how long, in some faith. The man might have been quite a machine as per complexity management in certain areas, but again, likely my mind now in the service of trying to trim down various things he found to be a possible catastrophe in his life. Both these men, as well as people not admirable like Pol Pot in Cambodia, as per the movie The Killing Fields. Likely, in my mind, catastrophe managers rather than joy and pleasure in the overall sense managers. It was in the service of managing what they felt would be a catastrophe if ever happened. And thus, their application of their science took us down a rabbit hole in the greatest proportions. And thus, in my mind, just to be, quote, scientific in the sense of being complex managing, if that even happens, is not always all what it appears to be. My parting thoughts thus.